She never thought she'd end up here, standing at the edge of a ghost town, clutching nothing but a small leather bag and the fading bruises on her wrists. Isabel Blackwood had been the picture-perfect wife of one of Montana's most respected cattle barons. At least that's what everyone in Redemption Creek believed. Behind closed doors, though, her marriage to Caleb Blackwood was anything but picture-perfect. For 7 years she'd smiled through gritted teeth at social gatherings, hidden bruises beneath high-collared dresses, and whispered silent prayers that someone would notice. But no one ever did. In the Wild West of 1885, a wife was property, and property didn't have the right to complain. That all changed the day Isabel discovered what happened to Caleb's first wife, the woman he claimed had abandoned him for a traveling salesman from St. Louis. Isabel still remembered the way Caleb had swept into her father's general store that first day, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor as he removed his hat in a gesture of politeness. He'd been so charming, so different from the other rough men who passed through their small Kansas town. With his clean-shaven face, pressed shirts, and gentle manner of speaking, he seemed like a dream compared to the dusty cowboys and desperate miners who usually darkened their doorway. Her father had practically glowed with pride when Caleb asked permission to court his daughter, a successful rancher with 3,000 acres and a fine house. What more could a father want for his only daughter? Isabel had been flattered by his attention, by the way his eyes followed her as she moved around the store, by the small gifts he'd bring, ribbons from Denver, chocolates from San Francisco. How could she have known that his charming smile masked a monster? The first year of marriage had been blissful. Their home outside Redemption Creek was everything Caleb had promised. A 2-story white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, furnished with items ordered from catalogs back east. The kitchen had a proper cast-iron stove. There were rugs on the wooden floors and even glass windows in every room. Isabel had been the envy of every woman in town when she rode beside Caleb in their shiny black buggy on Sundays. He'd been attentive, bringing her wildflowers he'd picked while out checking the fence lines, listening to her read aloud from novels in the evening by lamplight. She'd even started to believe that the stories she'd heard about the harshness of marriage in frontier lands were just tall tales meant to frighten young girls. Caleb was different, she told herself. He was educated, refined, a gentleman rancher who treated her like a queen. The warning signs were there, but in her youthful naivety, she'd missed them completely. It started with small things. A harsh word when dinner wasn't ready on time. A cold stare when she spoke too freely with the ranch hands. His hand gripping her arm too tightly when the young banker smiled at her in town. Isabel told herself it was normal. Just the natural possessiveness of a husband who loved his wife. When he began checking her personal correspondence and questioning her about every letter she wrote to her family back in Kansas, she convinced herself it was just his way of showing interest in her life. The first time he struck her, a sudden slap that left her ears ringing after she'd laughed too loudly at a social gathering. She'd been too shocked to cry. Later that night, his remorse had seemed so genuine, his tears so real as he begged forgiveness, promising it would never happen again. She believed him because she needed to believe him. There was nowhere else to go, no one to turn to. Her parents were 1,000 miles away, and divorce was scandalous, practically unheard of. Besides, what judge would rule against one of the most powerful men in the territory? The abuse escalated slowly, like water gradually coming to a boil. Isabel adapted, learning which behaviors triggered his rage and which earned his approval. She became an actress in her own life, playing the role of the perfect submissive wife whenever they were in public or entertaining guests at the ranch. She learned to apply makeup to hide the bruises, to smile through pain, to create elaborate explanations for injuries she couldn't conceal. "I'm so clumsy," became her constant refrain, accompanied by a self-deprecating laugh that never reached her eyes. The ranch hands averted their gaze when she appeared with a fresh bruise or limping slightly. The women in town whispered behind their hands, but never offered help. The local doctor treated her broken wrist once, looking at her with knowing eyes, but accepting her story about falling from her horse without question. Isolation became her prison, as Caleb gradually restricted her movements, her friendships, her connections to the outside world. By the 5th year of marriage, Isabel barely recognized the frightened, hollow-eyed woman who stared back at her from the mirror. Then came the rumors about Caleb's first wife, whispered by a new maid who didn't yet know what topics were forbidden in the Blackwood household. According to town gossip, Caleb had been married before moving to Montana, to a woman named Margaret from Denver. The story went that Margaret had run off with a traveling salesman, abandoning her husband and their comfortable life. Isabel had never heard this before. Caleb had never mentioned a previous marriage. That night, when Caleb was away on business, Isabel searched his study, a room she was forbidden to enter. In the back of his desk drawer, beneath stacks of property deeds and business contracts, she found a small daguerreotype of a young woman with sad eyes and a hesitant smile. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Margaret Blackwood, 1876. The discovery sent a chill down Isabel's spine. Why had Caleb hidden this? And what had really happened to Margaret? The maid was dismissed the next day, sent away with no explanation and no reference letter. But the seed of curiosity had been planted in Isabel's mind, growing like a weed she couldn't uproot. She began asking careful questions around town, presenting them as innocent interest in local history. Most people claimed to know nothing about Caleb's past before his arrival in Redemption Creek 6 years ago. But Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who ran the town's only boarding house, remembered something odd. He came to town with a woman, she confided to Isabel over tea one afternoon. Not the same one he left with, mind you. The first one was sickly-looking, nervous as a cat, stayed in their room most of the time while he was out making business arrangements. Then one day he came back alone, said she'd decided to return to her family back east. Next thing we know, he's bought the old Wilson place and is bringing in cattle from Texas. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, lowering her voice. Always thought it strange how quick that woman disappeared. No goodbyes, no nothing. And then not 3 months later he brings you to town as his new bride. Henderson's words, but she maintained her composure, thanking the older woman for the pleasant conversation. Walking home, her mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. She'd heard stories of men in the territories who went through wives like pairs of boots, women who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, while their husbands inherited their property or family money. Could Caleb be such a man? The thought was too horrible to contemplate, yet it burrowed into her mind like a parasite. That night she lay awake beside her sleeping husband, studying his profile in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom window. The face she once found handsome now seemed sinister, the strong jaw speaking of stubborn cruelty rather than determination. How well did she really know this man who shared her bed? And what had happened to the woman in the photograph, the first Mrs. Blackwood with the sad eyes? Isabel knew she needed proof, something more substantial than town gossip and her own growing fear. She began keeping a journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under her dressing table, documenting Caleb's abuse, his inconsistent stories about his past, the strange gaps in his history that he refused to explain. She needed allies, but in a town where Caleb Blackwood's influence touched everyone, true friends were hard to find. There was Sheriff Miller, but he and Caleb went hunting together every fall. Dr. Parker had treated her injuries, but he also depended on Caleb's generosity to fund the town's small hospital. The banker, Mr. Thompson, seemed to disapprove of Caleb's treatment of her, but would he risk his position to help a desperate woman? Isabel's options were limited, her movements watched, her every interaction scrutinized by Caleb or reported back to him by his loyal ranch hands. She needed someone outside Caleb's sphere of influence, someone with no ties to Redemption Creek or its powerful cattle baron. The opportunity came in the form of a young journalist named James Parker, who arrived in town seeking stories about frontier life for an Eastern newspaper. Isabel met him by chance at the general store, where his curious questions and Eastern manners immediately set him apart from the locals. Caleb was away on a cattle drive, giving Isabel rare freedom to move about town without his watchful eye. She struck up a conversation with the journalist, carefully steering it toward local history and notable residents. When James mentioned his interest in documenting the lives of pioneers who had settled the territory, Isabel suggested he might want to research Caleb Blackwood's rise to prominence. "My husband has quite an interesting past," she said casually, watching James scribble notes in his small leather-bound notebook, though some parts of his history seemed to have been forgotten. The gleam of journalistic instinct lit up in James's eyes, exactly as Isabel had hoped. She had planted the seed. Now she needed to nurture it without revealing her true intentions. Over the next 2 weeks, while Caleb remained away on business, Isabel orchestrated seemingly accidental meetings with James around town. Each time she dropped subtle hints about inconsistencies in Caleb's past, about the mysterious first Mrs. Blackwood who had vanished without a trace. It's odd that no one ever received a letter from her after she supposedly returned east. Isabel remarked during one such conversation. Her family in Denver claimed they never heard from her again. This was a fabrication. Isabel knew nothing about Margaret's family, but it served its purpose. James's journalistic instincts were fully awakened now, and he began conducting his own investigation, interviewing old-timers in town, searching through newspaper archives, even traveling to neighboring settlements to piece together Caleb Blackwood's past. Isabel watched from a distance, her heart racing with both hope and fear. If James discovered the truth about Margaret, it could be Isabel's salvation, or her death sentence if Caleb realized her involvement. James returned from his research trip the day before Caleb was due back from his cattle drive. Isabel met him secretly in the church, the one place in town where a meeting between them might be explained away innocently if they were discovered. The journalist's face was grim as he shared what he'd learned. Margaret Blackwood didn't return east, he said quietly, his voice echoing in the empty church. According to records in Helena, she's buried in an unmarked grave outside a mining town called Silver Creek. The death certificate lists the cause as domestic accident, a fall down the stairs. The local doctor who signed it left the territory shortly after, headed for California with a surprising amount of money for a small-town physician. He paused, watching Isabel's face carefully. There were rumors, Mrs. Blackwood. Rumors that her injuries weren't consistent with a fall. But no one wanted to challenge your husband's version of events. His influence was considerable even then. Isabel felt her legs weaken, and she sank into a pew, her worst fears confirmed. There's more, James continued reluctantly. Margaret wasn't his first wife. There was another, in Wyoming territory. She also died under questionable circumstances, a riding accident officially. But I found a witness who claimed she never rode, was terrified of horses. I have to disappear before he returns. James nodded, pulling out a small map from his coat pocket. I've made arrangements, he said, spreading the map on the pew between them. A stagecoach leaves for Billings tomorrow at dawn. From there, you can catch the eastbound train. I have a sister in Chicago who can help you start a new life. He pressed a small pouch into her hand. It jingled with the sound of coins. It's not much, but it should get you to Chicago. Isabel stared at him, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from a virtual stranger. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice breaking. James's expression darkened. My mother died at my father's hands when I was 12, he said quietly. No one helped her. I swore I'd never stand by and watch it happen to another woman. He squeezed her hand once, then stood. Pack only what you can carry in one bag. Meet me behind the livery stable an hour before dawn. I'll have a horse waiting to take you to the stagecoach stop outside town. She left her fine dresses, her books, all the trappings of the life she'd lived as Caleb Blackwood's wife. As she was about to leave the bedroom, she hesitated, then returned to the loose floorboard under her dressing table. She retrieved her journal, documenting years of abuse and Margaret's daguerreotype from where she'd hidden them. These weren't necessities for her journey, but they were evidence of Caleb's true nature, proof that might someday bring him to justice. As she slipped the items into her bag, she heard the unmistakable sound of horses in the yard, the low murmur of men's voices. Her blood turned to ice. Caleb wasn't due back until tomorrow. She moved to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtain, and peered out into the moonlit yard. Caleb was dismounting from his horse, laughing at something one of the ranch hands had said. He'd returned early, cutting off her escape route before she could even take it. Isabel's mind raced as she heard Caleb's heavy footsteps on the stairs. She quickly hid her packed bag in the wardrobe, tucked the journal and photograph back into their hiding place, and threw herself into bed, pretending to be asleep. The bedroom door creaked open, and she felt Caleb's presence like a physical weight in the darkness. Isabel, he said, his voice deceptively soft. I know you're awake. She feigned drowsiness, turning over slowly. Caleb, you're back early. Is everything all right? He stood at the foot of the bed, still fully dressed, his face in shadow. Interesting thing happened on the trail, he said conversationally, removing his gloves finger by finger. Ran into Pete Wilson from over Sweetwater Way. Said he'd been in town yesterday, saw my wife having a mighty intense conversation with some Eastern fellow at the church. Said it looked real private-like. Isabel's heart hammered in her chest, but years of hiding her true feelings served her well now. Oh, that must have been the journalist, she said, keeping her voice casual. He's writing an article about frontier towns. He wanted to know about the church's history, and since I helped with last year's Christmas pageant, Reverend Thomas suggested he speak with me. Funny thing is, I sent one of the boys into town right after I talked to Pete. Wanted to make sure everything was all right at home. He moved closer to the bed, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. John said he had a real interesting chat with this journalist fellow. Seems he's been asking all sorts of questions around town. Not about churches, though. About me. About my past. About my first wife. Isabel felt ice form in her veins, but she maintained her confused expression. That's strange, she said, sitting up in bed. He only asked me about the church and town events. Caleb's hand shot out, gripping her throat with lightning speed. Don't lie to me, Isabel, he hissed, his face inches from hers. John heard everything. This journalist has been digging into my business because of you. What did you tell him? What does he know? He asked about you because you're an important man in town. I only said good things, I swear. Caleb paced at the foot of the bed, his rage palpable in the small room. You've been sneaking around behind my back, conspiring with a stranger, he snarled. Did you think I wouldn't find out? There are no secrets in this town, Isabel. Not from me. He stopped pacing and turned to her, his expression suddenly calm in a way that terrified her more than his anger. We're leaving at first light, he announced. I've got business interests up north, near the Canadian border. Isolated country, good grazing land. We'll start fresh there, just the two of us. Isabel's blood ran cold at his words. Isolated country, no witnesses, no one to hear her screams, no one to notice when she disappeared, just like Margaret had disappeared. It'll take me some time to pack everything, Isabel said, trying to sound practical while her mind screamed in panic. The good china, the linens, my books. Caleb cut her off with a dismissive wave. Pack only what you need for the journey. The rest stays here. We'll buy new things. His meaning was clear. He wanted no trace of their life in Redemption Creek to follow them. Isabel nodded meekly, her mind racing for a way out of this trap. I'll start packing right away, she said, moving to get out of bed. Caleb pushed her back down roughly. In the morning, he said. Tonight you stay right here where I can see you. I don't trust you anymore, Isabel. He settled himself in the armchair by the window, his rifle across his lap, his eyes never leaving her. Get some sleep, he said with mock concern. We've got a long journey ahead of us. Isabel lay back, her mind a whirlwind of fear and desperate planning. She knew with absolute certainty that if she went with Caleb to this isolated northern property, she would never return. She needed to escape. But how? With Caleb watching her every move, her options were non-existent. She closed her eyes, feigning sleep while silently praying for a miracle. Dawn was just breaking when Isabel heard it, the sound of horses and men's voices in the yard below. Caleb, who had dozed off in the chair sometime during the night, jerked awake, moving quickly to the window. What the hell? He muttered, grabbing his rifle. Isabel rose from the bed, moving to stand behind him as he peered out. In the gray morning light, she could see Sheriff Miller and 3 deputies in the yard, along with James Parker. The journalist was gesturing animatedly, pointing toward the house. Stay here, Caleb ordered, his voice tight with anger. He stormed out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. Isabel didn't hesitate. She grabbed her hidden bag from the wardrobe, retrieved the journal and photograph from beneath the floorboard, and moved to the window. There was a trellis of climbing roses beneath, reaching almost to the ground. She'd never attempted to climb it before, but now her life depended on it. She threw her bag down first, wincing at the muted thud it made in the soft earth below. Then, taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the windowsill and began her descent. The thorns tore at her hands and nightdress, but Isabel barely felt the pain. So focused was she on reaching the ground without being seen. She could hear Caleb's voice now, raised in anger as he confronted the men in the front yard. This is outrageous. You have no right to come onto my property making wild accusations. Sheriff Miller's response was too low to catch, but his tone was firm. Isabel reached the bottom of the trellis and crouched in the shadow of the house, listening. James Parker's voice carried clearly in the morning air. I have evidence, Mr. Blackwood. Witness statements, inconsistencies in official reports, financial transactions that raise serious questions about the deaths of both your previous wives. There was a sudden commotion, shouting, the sound of a scuffle. Isabel peered around the corner of the house just in time to see Caleb break free from the deputy's grasp, drawing a hidden pistol from his vest. You'll hang me over my dead body, he roared, raising the gun. Sheriff Miller was faster. His shot rang out, echoing across the ranch yard. Caleb staggered backward, a look of disbelief on his face before crumpling to the ground. Isabel stood frozen, watching as the deputies surrounded Caleb's fallen form. Sheriff Miller knelt beside him, checking for signs of life, then shook his head grimly. James Parker broke away from the group, his eyes scanning the house and grounds until they found Isabel, still partially hidden by the corner of the building. Relief washed over his features as he hurried toward her. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you hurt?" he asked, taking in her torn nightdress and bleeding hands. Isabel looked past him to where her husband lay dead in the dirt of the ranch yard he'd been so proud of. She should have felt something. Grief, relief, shock, but all she felt was a strange numbness, as if she were watching events happen to someone else. "I'm fine," she said automatically, clutching her bag to her chest. "What happens now?" James guided her gently away from the scene, toward the kitchen entrance at the back of the house. "The sheriff will want to take your statement," he said, "and there will be questions about your husband's past, about Margaret and the other wife in Wyoming. But you're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore." There had been 3 wives before Isabel, not 2 as they'd initially thought. All had died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths ruled accidents by officials who had been bribed or intimidated into silence. Isabel testified before a judge, detailing her years of suffering and her discovery of Margaret's fate. The town of Redemption Creek, once so willing to look the other way, now buzzed with the scandal. Some blamed Isabel, suggesting she had somehow provoked Caleb's abuse or orchestrated his death. Others, particularly the women, offered quiet support, sharing their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of husbands and fathers. Isabel listened to it all with a growing sense of detachment. None of it mattered anymore. Caleb was dead. She was free. But freedom, she was discovering, came with its own challenges. The ranch and all of Caleb's holdings were tied up in legal complications. There were questions about his will, about the rightful inheritance of his first wives' families, about debts and partnerships and business arrangements that had never been properly documented. Isabel found herself living in a strange limbo, still residing in the house she had shared with Caleb, but no longer mistress of it in any meaningful way. James Parker remained in town, continuing his investigation for what had become a series of sensational articles for his newspaper back east. He visited Isabel often, bringing books and news from outside, listening patiently as she slowly began to process everything that had happened. "What will you do now?" he asked her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. Isabel considered the question, realizing she had been so focused on survival for so long that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond it. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't stay here, surrounded by these memories, but I don't know where else to go." On her last day in Redemption Creek, she visited the small-town cemetery, where Caleb was buried in an unmarked grave. She felt no need to leave flowers or say goodbye. Instead, she turned her back on the freshly turned earth and walked to another section of the cemetery, where a new headstone stood gleaming in the sunlight. She had used some of her settlement money to provide Margaret Blackwood and the other victims with proper graves, their names and dates carved in stone as a permanent record of their existence. "I survived," Isabel whispered to these women she had never met, but with whom she shared a terrible bond. "I survived, and now everyone knows what he did to you. You won't be forgotten again." She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of each stone, then straightened, squaring her shoulders as she walked away. James Parker was waiting for her at the stagecoach stop, his bags packed alongside hers. He had completed his investigation, filed his final article, and was returning east. He had asked Isabel to come with him, not as a romantic gesture, but as a friend offering a fresh start. "My sister still has that spare room in Chicago," he reminded her with a gentle smile. "And there are opportunities there for a woman with your strength and intelligence. Schools looking for teachers, publishers seeking editorial assistants, women's organizations fighting for change." Isabel looked back at the town of Redemption Creek, at the life she was leaving behind. For 7 years she had been Caleb Blackwood's wife, defined by her relationship to him, valued only for what she could provide: her beauty, her housekeeping skills, her social graces that reflected well on him. Now, for the first time since she was a young girl in her father's store, she was simply Isabel, free to define herself on her own terms. "I'm ready," she said, taking James's offered hand as he helped her into the waiting stagecoach. As the horses pulled away, taking her toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Isabel didn't look back. Her story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. The story of Isabel Blackwood might have faded into obscurity, just another frontier tale of hardship and survival, if not for what happened next. 3 years after leaving Redemption Creek, Isabel published a slim volume titled Behind Closed Doors, a survivor's account of domestic tyranny on the American frontier. Writing under the pseudonym A Western Wife, Isabel detailed not only her own experiences but those of countless other women she had interviewed during her new life as a journalist for a women's reform magazine in Chicago. The book caused an immediate sensation, shocking Eastern readers with its unflinching portrayal of the abuse that often lurked beneath the romantic veneer of frontier life. Critics denounced it as sensationalist fiction, a slanderous attack on the character of frontier men. But women knew better. The book sold out its first printing within weeks, passed from hand to hand, discussed in hushed tones in parlors and sewing circles across America. Letters poured in from women thanking A Western Wife for giving voice to their secret suffering, for making them feel less alone. The success of Behind Closed Doors catapulted Isabel into the forefront of the emerging women's rights movement. Though she maintained her pseudonym in public, she became a powerful voice behind the scenes, working with activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to push for legal reforms that would protect women from abusive husbands. She testified before state legislatures, sharing her story to put a human face on the abstract legal concepts being debated. The law currently treats a wife as her husband's property, she told a group of New York state senators. It gives him the right to discipline her as he sees fit, denies her control over her own earnings, and offers no recourse when that power is abused. I am not asking for special treatment for women. I am asking for basic human dignity and protection under the law. The senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to hearing such direct language from a woman, especially one speaking about topics considered too delicate for public discussion. But Isabel had long since stopped caring about social niceties. She had survived too much to be silenced by mere discomfort. In 1895, 10 years after her escape from Caleb Blackwood, Isabel returned to the West for the first time. The frontier was rapidly disappearing by then, the wild spaces increasingly tamed by railroads, telegraph lines, and the steady advance of civilization. Redemption Creek had grown into a proper town, with a brick schoolhouse, a bank made of stone instead of wood, and a population that no longer depended entirely on the fortunes of the cattle industry. Isabel was there at the invitation of the newly formed Women's Literary Society, who had discovered her true identity and asked her to speak about her book and her advocacy work. She stood on the stage of the town hall, looking out at faces both familiar and new. Some of the older residents remembered her as Caleb Blackwood's quiet, seemingly contented wife. They stared in amazement at the confident woman before them, dressed in the latest Eastern fashion, speaking with authority about legal reform and women's education. The younger women leaned forward in their seats, drinking in every word from this living embodiment of survival and reinvention. I didn't write my book to shock or scandalize, Isabel told the packed hall. I wrote it because silence protects abusers. When we refuse to speak about what happens behind closed doors, we become complicit in that abuse. How many of you knew what was happening in my marriage? How many suspected but looked away? An uncomfortable murmur ran through the crowd. I don't blame you, Isabel continued, her voice softening. Our society teaches us that family matters are private, that a husband's treatment of his wife is no one else's concern. I believed that too once. I stayed silent out of shame, out of fear, out of the belief that I somehow deserved what was happening to me. But silence nearly cost me my life, just as it cost the lives of the women who came before me. We must do better. We must speak the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. We must stand up for each other, even when it's difficult. And we must demand that our legal system recognize the humanity and dignity of all people, regardless of their gender. As she finished speaking, the hall erupted in applause, led by the women in the audience but gradually joined by many of the men as well. After her talk, Isabel visited the expanded cemetery on the edge of town. The graves of Caleb's victims were well maintained now, adorned with fresh flowers and small tokens, evidence that others had been visiting, remembering these women whose stories might otherwise have been lost to history. As Isabel stood there, a young woman approached, nervously twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Mrs. Blackwood, or, I suppose it's Miss Jenkins now, she began hesitantly, using Isabel's maiden name, which she had reclaimed after leaving Redemption Creek. My name is Sarah Collins, my husband. She trailed off, eyes darting around to ensure they were alone. Isabel recognized the signs immediately. The fading bruise poorly concealed with powder, the way Sarah held herself as if her ribs were tender, the constant vigilance of someone living in fear. Would you like to sit and talk for a while? Isabel asked gently, gesturing to a nearby bench. Sarah nodded gratefully, and as they sat together in the peaceful cemetery, Isabel listened as another woman's story of abuse and isolation poured out. When Sarah finished, tears streaming down her face, Isabel took her hands firmly. You are not alone, she said with quiet intensity. And this is not your fault. There are options, possibilities you may not have considered. Will you let me help you? For every woman like Isabel who escaped, for every legal reform passed, for every shift in public opinion about the acceptability of domestic violence, there remained countless women trapped in abusive marriages, silenced by shame, fear, and social pressure. But Isabel continued fighting, drawing strength from the knowledge that her words had reached women like Sarah Collins, offering them a lifeline of hope and practical assistance. She established one of the first shelters for abused women in Chicago, a safe house where they could bring their children and begin rebuilding their lives away from violent husbands. She worked with sympathetic lawyers to help women navigate the still biased legal system, fighting for fair divisions of property and custody of children in the rare cases when divorce was possible. And she continued writing, producing articles, pamphlets, and eventually more books that shattered the conspiracy of silence surrounding domestic abuse. In one of her later works, reflecting on her journey from terrified victim to outspoken advocate, Isabel wrote, "Freedom comes not just from escaping physical bonds, but from breaking the internal chains of self-doubt and shame that keep us captive long after we've left our abusers. True liberation lies in reclaiming our voices, in telling our stories without apology, and in using our hard-won wisdom to light the path for others still finding their way out of darkness." The shelter she founded in Chicago became a model for similar institutions across the country. The legal reforms she championed gradually transformed how domestic violence was viewed and treated by the courts. Her books remained in print, finding new readers with each generation of women searching for validation of their experiences and guidance for their own journeys to safety and self-determination. But perhaps her most enduring impact was on the countless individual women whose lives she touched directly. The Sarahs who found courage through her example, the readers who recognized their own situations in her words and took their first steps toward freedom, the activists inspired by her unflinching honesty to continue the work of creating a world where home was truly a safe place for everyone. In 1916, 3 decades after her escape from Redemption Creek, Isabel was present at the dedication of a new wing of the Chicago Women's Hospital, named in her honor, and dedicated to treating victims of domestic violence with dignity and specialized care. Looking at the plaque bearing her name, Isabel remembered the frightened young woman who had climbed down a rose trellis in her nightgown, clutching a bag of meager possessions and desperate for escape. "We survived," she whispered, echoing the words she had spoken at Margaret's grave so many years before. "We survived, and we made sure no one could forget what happened to us." Her health had been declining for several years by then, the result of injuries sustained during her marriage that had never properly healed, but she insisted on being present for this historic moment. Supported by James Parker, who had remained her faithful friend and ally throughout the decades, she made her way to the polling station on Election Day, her back straight despite the pain, her eyes bright with triumph. As she cast her ballot, something that would have been unimaginable to the young bride who had arrived in Redemption Creek with stars in her eyes and no conception of the horrors that awaited her, tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "For Margaret," she said quietly. "For all of them." James squeezed her hand in understanding, his own eyes damp. They both knew that while this victory was monumental, it was just one step in a much longer journey toward true equality and justice. The vote alone couldn't protect a woman from an abusive husband, couldn't guarantee her economic independence or bodily autonomy, but it was a beginning, a recognition of women's full citizenship and humanity under the law, and Isabel had lived to see it. Isabel Blackwood passed away peacefully in her sleep on a snowy Chicago night in December 1923. She was found by her housekeeper the next morning, a half-written letter on the desk beside her bed. The letter was addressed to a young woman who had recently escaped an abusive marriage and sought Isabel's advice on starting a new life. Even in her final hours, Isabel had been reaching out, offering the guidance and support she had once so desperately needed herself. Her funeral was attended by prominent suffragists and social reformers, by lawyers and doctors who had worked with her shelter, by ordinary women whose lives she had touched through her writings or direct intervention. But the most moving tribute came several days after the funeral, when hundreds of women, survivors of domestic violence who had found strength in Isabel's words and example, gathered for a candlelight vigil outside her home. They stood in silence, their lights forming a beacon visible from blocks away, a collective acknowledgement of one woman's courage and its ripple effect across countless lives. In the spring, following Isabel's wishes, her ashes were taken back to Redemption Creek and scattered on the graves of Caleb's victims, completing a circle that had begun nearly 40 years earlier with her discovery of Margaret's photograph. The world that Isabel Blackwood left behind was still deeply flawed, still riddled with injustice and inequality. Domestic violence remained a pressing social issue, often ignored or minimized by authorities. Women still struggled for economic independence, reproductive rights, and equal treatment under the law. But change was happening, slowly but inexorably, pushed forward by women inspired by pioneers like Isabel, who had dared to speak uncomfortable truths and demand better. In the decades that followed her death, as women continued the fight for equality on multiple fronts, Isabel's story was passed down as both warning and inspiration, a reminder of how far society had come and how far it still needed to go. Her books were republished in the 1970s during the second wave of feminism, finding a new audience hungry for historical perspectives on women's struggles. Scholars began studying her work, recognizing her as an early and influential voice in the movement against domestic violence. And in Redemption Creek, now a small city with a university and a growing tourism industry focused on its Wild West heritage, the Historical Society maintained a small museum dedicated to Isabel's life and work, ensuring that visitors looking for cowboy adventures also encountered the darker realities of frontier life for women. In 2023, a century after Isabel's death, a young filmmaker named Maya Rodriguez stumbled across her story while researching a documentary about women's experiences on the American frontier. Fascinated by this early advocate against domestic violence whose work had predated the modern shelter movement by decades, Maya dug deeper, tracking down Isabel's surviving papers, visiting the sites where she had lived and worked, interviewing descendants of people who had known her in both Redemption Creek and Chicago. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who had transformed unimaginable trauma into powerful advocacy, who had refused to be silenced or shamed, who had dedicated her life to ensuring that other women would not suffer as she had. Maya's documentary, titled Behind Closed Doors in homage to Isabel's groundbreaking book, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and went on to win an Academy Award. In her acceptance speech, Maya held up a copy of Isabel's book and said simply, "This is for Isabel, and for all the women whose stories have been erased from history. We remember you, we honor you, and we continue your work." As the camera panned across the audience, it captured hundreds of people on their feet, applauding not just Maya's film, but the enduring legacy of a woman who had climbed down a rose trellis in the dawn light and into a future she could barely imagine. The story of Isabel Blackwood continues to resonate in the 21st century, not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a still relevant narrative about courage, resilience, and the power of speaking truth. In classrooms, therapy groups, and online forums, women and men engage with her story, drawing parallels to contemporary issues of domestic violence, coercive control, and the ongoing struggle for gender equality. Historians have contextualized her work within the broader women's rights movement, noting how her focus on domestic violence and practical assistance for survivors complemented the more visible political campaigns for suffrage and legal reform. Social workers cite her shelter model as an early example of trauma-informed care, recognizing how her personal experience informed her approach to helping other survivors. And in Redemption Creek, now primarily a tourist destination trading on its frontier heritage, annual Isabel Blackwood Day celebrations honor her legacy with educational programs, fundraisers for the local domestic violence shelter, and candlelight vigils echoing the one held after her death. Her story has been woven into the fabric of American history, no longer hidden or marginalized but recognized as a crucial thread in understanding the nation's past and shaping its future. Perhaps the most powerful testament to Isabel's impact lies not in museums or documentaries, but in the lives of individuals who continue to find strength in her example. Women leaving abusive relationships still carry copies of her books as talismans of possibility. Advocates fighting for stronger legal protections invoke her name in legislative hearings. Survivors gathering in support groups share her words, finding in them validation and hope. The details of her life, the rose trellis escape, the hidden journal, the pseudonymous book that shocked a nation, have taken on an almost mythic quality, symbols of the extraordinary courage ordinary women can summon when pushed to their limits. And in this mythologizing lies a profound truth, that one person's refusal to accept injustice, one voice raised against prevailing silence, can echo across generations, inspiring others to find their own courage and speak their own truths. Isabel Blackwood climbed down from a second-story window in 1885, carrying little more than determination and hope. What she built with those humble resources, a movement, a legacy, a path forward for countless others, continues to grow and evolve, a living monument to the power of survival transformed into advocacy. As we reflect on Isabel's journey from terrified victim to celebrated reformer, certain truths emerge that transcend her specific historical context. First, that silence and isolation are the abuser's greatest weapons, and breaking that silence, whether to a trusted friend, a journalist, or a wider public, is often the first step toward freedom. Second, that survival itself is an act of revolution when systems are designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Third, that individual healing and collective action are intertwined. Isabel found her own recovery in helping others, and in doing so, created ripples of change that extended far beyond her personal sphere. And finally, that progress is neither linear nor inevitable, but requires constant vigilance and renewal of commitment across generations. The legal protections and social services available to abuse survivors today would seem miraculous to Isabel, yet domestic violence remains a pervasive problem worldwide. Her work continues through all who recognize that the safety of the vulnerable is a measure of society's humanity, and who refuse to look away from suffering or accept injustice as inevitable. In the end, Isabel Blackwood's legacy is not just about what she accomplished in her lifetime, the books written, the laws changed, the shelter established, the individual women helped. It's about the ongoing conversation she started, a conversation that continues to challenge comfortable assumptions and push society toward greater justice and compassion. It's about the courage to imagine a different future when the present seems unbearable, and the determination to build that future step by painstaking step. It's about the power of story to connect us across time and circumstance, to help us recognize our common humanity and our shared stake in creating a world free from violence and oppression. Each time Isabel's story is told, in classrooms and courtrooms, in therapy sessions and policy debates, in documentaries and dinner table conversations, it serves as both mirror and window, reflecting our continuing struggles with the same issues she confronted, while opening vistas of possibility for how they might be addressed. In this way, the frightened young bride who fled Redemption Creek lives on, her voice joining the chorus of all who dare to speak truth to power and demand a better world.